James Pollock is the author of Sailing to Babylon, which was a finalist for the Griffin Poetry Prize and the Governor-General's Literary Award in Poetry. Runner-up for the Posner.
I think that's how you say it, yeah.
Okay. Posner Poetry Book Award and winner of an Outstanding Achievement Award in Poetry from the Wisconsin Library Association. And You Are Here, which we are here to talk about. Essays on the Art of Poetry in Canada, a finalist for the ForeWord Review's Book of the Year Award for a collection of essays. He is also editor of the Essential Daryl Hine, which made the Partisan's list of the best books of 2015. His poems have been published in the Paris Review, AGNI, Poetry Daily, The Fiddlehead, The National Post, and other journals in the US and Canada. The poems have been broadcast on CBC Radio, listed in Best Canadian Poetry, and reprinted in anthologies in Canada, the US, and the UK. His critical essays and reviews have appeared in many leading literary journals. He earned a PhD in Literature and Creative Writing from the University of Houston and is now Professor of English and Creative Writing at Loras College in
Dubuque.
You could have fooled me the way that was written. Is written. Dubuque, Iowa, where he teaches poetry, writing, Shakespeare, Canadian literature, and modern and contemporary American poetry. He lives with his wife and son in Madison, Wisconsin, where we are today, again, to talk about his book of essays published by Porcupine's Quill called You Are Here, Essays on the Art of Poetry in Canada. Welcome to the Bibliophile.
Thank you very much, Nigel. My pleasure.
Now, on the back cover of the book, someone has written, Northrop Frye, the question of identity for Canadian poets isn't who am I, but where is here. James says the answer has to do with our relationship to elsewhere. Canadians have refused to read our poetry in the larger international context of poetry as an art. So where is here?
I mean, rather than answering it in general terms, I think in the book, the essays try to place particular poems in relationship to other poems by other poets from all over the world. So rather than approaching it from a sort of theoretical perspective and making broad general statements about Canadian poetry or Canadian literature, what I'm really trying to do is read individual poems and particular poets in a larger international poetic context. So in terms of the title of the book, it's really where are you, where are we as we're reading any particular poem.
Okay. The same point, I think, was made by Carmine Starnino in his book A Lover's Quarrel about 20 years ago.
Sure.
Quite famously.
Yeah.
Or as famous as a Canadian poetry critic can be.
Sure. And I mean, there's a whole tradition of this, goes back at least to A.J.M. Smith back in the, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, etc. What at the time was called the cosmopolitan school or whatever you want to call it. In other words, just this idea that, as Milan Kundera says in a wonderful book called The Curtain, which is about the novel in the 20th century, particularly from an East European perspective, he makes the case that in small countries in particular, in all countries really, including big empires, this is a problem, but in small countries in particular, there's an eternal danger of provincialism, which is the idea that you should or can only read your country's literature in the context of the nation. And the problem with that, as he says, is that it cuts you off from the rest of the literary world. Just something, it was a rude awakening to me when I went to graduate school in Houston. And, I was encountering all of these extremely well-read poets and poetry students, and none of them read Canadian poetry at all. you would mention Canadian poetry and their eyes would sort of, you could tell they're like thinking, oh, this is embarrassing, I've never read Canadian poetry.
Well, and is that because it's just not good enough to make an impact on the world, or it wasn't?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of ways to answer that question, but I think it's partly a matter of one of the historical problems for Canadian poetry is that our anthologies have been, generally speaking, not great in terms of the choices they make. And so there was this infamous moment in something like 1999 when a British critic named, was that Michael Schmidt? No, he's the guy who wrote
the thick
the
poetry
Lives
book.
of the Poets.
Yeah.
Was he the guy who said Canadian poetry is a short street?
He did.
Something like that.
You quote him as saying
Right.
that, yeah.
And when I read that, the first thing that occurred to me is, oh, he's been reading our anthologies, right? His view of Canadian poetry is, based on, I don't know what, like the New Oxford Anthology of Canadian Verse in English or something like that. And so, understandably, somebody outside of Canada is not going to start by spending enormous amounts of time reading every Canadian poet they can find. They're going to start with an anthology. And if they are disappointed by what they're discovering in the anthology, they're going to stop.
Yeah.
So hence short street, right? So that's one of the problems.
It's kind of interesting how important, we don't think of anthologies necessarily being that important, but in terms of around the world, they are, aren't they?
Sure.
Quite influential.
Yeah, there was this moment, I think, was it the 80s, early 80s, when Czesław Miłosz, the Polish poet who was living in California at the time, published an anthology called Post-War Polish Poetry. And it's just this modest little drab-looking paperback thing, but it had an enormous influence in American poetry when it hit.
Uh-huh.
And that's because Miłosz was a brilliant editor of that anthology. Of course, he had a lot of wonderful poets to choose from as well. So, but the point is that, an anthology can have an enormous effect on the way people in other countries read a nation's literature. And I mean, those were all poems in translation, too. They were poems in English translation. So, of course, something was lost in the translation, but even so, people were like, who are these Poles? And they discovered these, Zbigniew Herbert and Miłosz himself and Alexander Watt and what's her name? The one who won the Nobel Prize.
I can't remember.
Wisława Szymborska and several others. And people said, oh, there's this great poetry being written in the late 20th century by these Polish poets. And so then suddenly everybody started translating them and, reading them. And everybody, when I was in graduate school, granted, one of my professors was Adam Zagajewski, who was a Polish poet. He was a sort of slightly younger generation, but still, he wasn't the only one who knew all these poets. I mean, the other professors all knew them extremely well, and my fellow students all knew them. But yeah, in terms of Canadian poetry, if you went into a Barnes & Noble back in the 90s, you'd see some Leonard Cohen, some Margaret Atwood, and some Michael Ondaatje, and that's it. And, and those were not even really the poets who my fellow students or professors read. They didn't read them.
What's the difference now, though? I mean, you go in now, maybe Anne Carson you'd see, and of course,
Rupi
Kaur.
Yeah,
She just swamps everyone else.
Sure. So yeah, and there's this strange, totally understandable, totally natural blindness to Canadian poetry that, the only way that's going to get fixed or improved is if you have somebody edit a truly brilliant anthology of the very best Canadian poetry and publish it internationally. And that hasn't really happened.
You did say, though, and you did review one anthology that
yes.
came out as a result of what Schmidt said. Right?
Yeah, Evan Jones and Todd Swift, Modern Canadian Poets. Yeah, which is a pretty good anthology. It's way better than many other anthologies. It could be better. Yeah. But it's an enormous improvement. And one of the ways that it's such a big improvement is that it has the courage to exclude a lot of quite bad poets.
Well, I think that's the point that you make is when you went to university and you started studying these supposedly great Canadian poets, you were very disappointed.
Yeah.
I'm thinking George Bowering, Fred Waugh, Margaret Atwood even, and also the concrete language. Is it concrete or language poets?
Well,
B.P.
language.
Nicol and,
B.P. Nicol and Steve McCaffrey and all that stuff.
Yeah.
And the Tish, all of that.
Yeah.
I'm glad you brought that up because that's really one of the main reasons I wrote this book. In terms of, thinking of it rhetorically, who is my imagined reader? And it was really myself at 19 or 22 or someone like that who, is in university and studying Homer and Shakespeare and Milton and Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson and all that, Yeats.
Yeah.
And then
truly great.
Right. And then trying to find what's good in Canadian literature. And of course, where do you start? You start with the anthologies. You start with, somebody wins a prize, you pick up their book, you sort of browse around in the bookstore, you read the blurbs on the backs of books. And at the time, I didn't know anything about how the literary world works in terms of, prizes and blurbs and editing anthologies. I was naive about all of that. And I just thought, so the impression you get if you're just reading around in some anthology is, wow, this stuff is pretty bad. But of course, when you're 19, you don't really trust your critical judgment, and you think, well, if everybody else is saying it's wonderful, then...
Well, plus if they're being taught
in
universities by professors who are authoritative.
That's right, and saying, this is very important, this is, had a big influence, and this was significant, and you start to think, well, okay, there must be something wrong with the way I'm missing something here.
I'm not working hard enough.
Right. And I mean, and partly it's because you have that experience learning any poet. So I have this vivid memory. I was at York University. My teacher was a guy named Don Summerhays. He was a poetry writing professor, but he also taught a course in American poetry. And we were reading Robert Frost in there. And I remember saying to him, he'd assigned a bunch of poems, and we came in the next day, and before class, he came up to me and he said, "So what do you think?" And I was like, I don't know. I don't really get it. I don't really like it. It's too rhymey. It's too sing-songy or something. And he just sort of gave me this look of like, he fixed me with this sort of scowl or something, which is really unusual for him because he's a very genial guy. And he just said, "Try it again." So I thought, okay, it's me, right? Yeah. And then I went back and I did try it again. And now, of course, I'm a huge lover of Robert Frost. And I realized, okay, you have to have a certain humility, and you have to understand that you need to learn these poets. It takes time to learn these poets. And
so how did you learn that, Frost? Like, how does it go from I really don't like this too.
Sure.
This is the best thing I've ever read.
Yeah, great question. Well, it takes time and patience. This is where critics can come in.
Yeah.
So, for instance, at some point in graduate school, one of my professors recommended Randall Jarrell, The Poet in the Age, or Poetry in the Age, which is a great book of contemporary review type, essays and reviews. And I read his essay on Frost. And I think at that point I'd already started to get Frost, I started to get him in that.
So how do you get him?
Well, rereading, reading criticism, trying to write about the poems yourself, listening to Frost. I mean, one thing that people often say is they hear a poet read or a recording of a poet reading their work, and a light goes off, and they're like, "Oh, I get it. I get the tone now."
But there wasn't one piece of advice that was given to you, or one line that sort of was the start of the change?
Oh, I don't know if I can remember that specifically, but I mean, the advice was try it again. Yeah,
okay.
And you just keep trying it again, right?
But you need to be motivated. You need...
Well, sure.
A lot, the average reader isn't motivated.
I mean, it's funny that I'm using Frost as an example because he's such a popular poet, right? Mm-hmm. During his lifetime, he sold enough books to live on. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so he was, he was a kind of popular commercial poet as well as critically acclaimed and so on, which is really unusual. But yeah, I mean, I think what it was for me, one of the things that I've discovered is you have to understand what your limitations are as a reader. And at the time, when I was 19 or 20, my limitation was that I'd never really been taught how to read meter and rhyme. And so I read it with too much emphasis, too much regularity, too much emphasis on the rhyme. And so it just felt too sing-songy or too, I had no ear. I had not developed an ear for what Frost calls the sound of sense, which is the human voice embodied in the cadence, the grammar, the phrases, and the way that plays off against the meter in a kind of counterpoint. All I was hearing was the meter and the rhyme. So instead of whose woods these are, I think I know, which is a natural human way of saying it, I would be reading, whose woods these are, I think I know. Mm-hmm. His house is in the village, though, right? And that's horrible. So it's the way you're taught to read. And one of the problems with the way poetry is often taught, because many readers are introduced to free verse, and they read lots and lots of free verse. I have nothing against free verse. Free verse can be wonderful. But if you're never taught how to read the cadence of the grammar against the meter, then when you encounter metrical verse, you just think, oh, this sounds terribly old-fashioned, and it doesn't make any sense because all you're hearing is the meter and rhyme. And so you just say, okay, well, I don't like that kind of poetry, which is then what you're doing is you're eliminating 90% of all poetry in English when you do that. I mean, that is just inexperience as a reader. So you have to have enough humility to be able to recognize that and begin to overcome it. So in the case of Frost, if there's anybody out there who is not sure about a poet like Frost, just listen to him read his poems, and it will completely change the way you encounter a Frost poem on the page, because he's such a brilliant reader of his own work.
It's funny, that puts me in mind of going to see Shakespeare plays. It's so difficult to act it the right way. Mm-hmm. But when you come across an actor who knows how to speak the lines, they're the same lines, but they make sense in a weird way. They won't make sense if someone doesn't do it the right way, and it becomes almost impenetrable. Yeah. But for whatever reason, some actors know how to read it correctly, and it makes it comprehensible.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I teach a course called Poetry and Performance. I'm about to start it, actually. It's a January term course. And the whole point of the course is we approach poetry with acting techniques so that it's not only an intellectual reading of the poem. It's physical, it's emotional, it's imaginative. You have to, the students memorize the poem, so it becomes literally, physically part of them. And they get up in front of the class and they recite the poems, and we coach them. The whole class gives them feedback, and we say, no. I mean, first I teach them some basic public speaking techniques like slow down, speak louder, look your audience in the eye, that kind of thing, speak naturally. And we get to the point where, at first the students are up there reading whose woods these are, I think I know, like that. And we say, no, you have to read it like you are actually feeling this. And then they try it, and then we say, okay, that was pretty good, but now make these changes. And by the end of some of those classes, students are, tearing up. Not just the ones reciting, but the kids in the audience too, and that's so rewarding. Then they really get what this is about. This is about real human emotion. It's about the beauty of the language. It's a physical thing. It's not about, okay, we're going to do a detached intellectual reading and find the idea in the poem and all of that. I don't mean to denigrate the intellectual part, but if that's all you're doing, you're missing 3/4 of what's going on in poetry. And unfortunately, the way poetry tends to be taught in schools is there's this idea that, okay, there's a secret code, and your job as a reader is to decipher the secret message. And so once you've read the poem, I want you to be able to say what it's about, what it means. I mean, often what poems mean are pretty banal things like, I will love you forever, or my heart is broken. Since you left me, I'm going to die. Pretty, the content is not really the point. It's the rhetoric and the sound and the emotion of it, the imagery. Those are the things that matter. And when all you're doing is decoding the poem to find the meaning, you're basically killing the poem, and you're just taking out some content that is not of the essence. And that therefore kids in their English classes end up hating this stuff. They're like, what's the point? Why not just say what you mean? Right? They begin to associate it with all of the deception in the world, adults with their double meanings and their hidden agendas, and it's all
they're made to think there's a right and a wrong, and there isn't. I can't get it. I don't get it. I don't get the answer.
Sure. The other part of that, thinking of what you just said, is that I'll often get students who are English majors who will come in with this sense that, well, anything you say about a poem is right because it's just your opinion. There's no right answer, right? And I say, well, look, it's true that this is not mathematics where there's one correct answer and other incorrect answers. It's more like there's a limited number of plausible interpretations here, not an infinite variety, a fairly limited number. And your job as a critic, one of your jobs as a critic, if you're interpreting something, is to have an insight about what you think is going on in the poem, and then make an argument to support that thesis, right? And
make it a damn persuasive argument.
That's right.
Too.
That's right. And if somebody else has a different reading of the poem, it's up to them to produce an even stronger argument, right? And if you disagree with what some critic says about a poem, then it's up to you to make the case that your reading is better. But you're not going to have an infinite number of readings. Now, granted, in the case of somebody like Shakespeare, there are an awful lot, but that's a case of somebody who is so great that the interpretations multiply because time passes and society changes, and that's a special case.
Let's get back to our book.
Sure.
The way you lay it out is interesting. You put a kind of a theory, your theory of poetry, the art of poetry at the back end. And I thought it might be better positioned at the front so that we could read what your theory is and then see how you applied it. But
yeah, it originally was at the front.
Oh, was it?
My editor said, "No, I can't sell this. You've got to put it at the back." So
okay. And then right before that, you have something called "On Criticism: A Self-Interview," which is sort of an interesting back and forth with yourself about some of the more practical aspects of criticism. So there's a lot in your Art of Poetry essay that I'd like to get to.
Sure.
Starting with the fact that Canadian critics, you say, young Canadian critics, have failed to articulate fundamental ideas about poetry and poetic value, neglecting the wider intellectual context of the art. So what's the wider intellectual context?
Well, this is what Kundera is talking about in his book, that, the context of poetry, of a poem, is poetry. It's not Canadian poetry. But in terms of the wider intellectual context, I'm talking about the whole history of thinking about poetry. I'm thinking about philosophers and theorists and critics and poet critics and poets who've, thought about these issues since the beginning of time. That's what I mean by the wider intellectual context of poetry. And, one of the things I say in that essay near the beginning is that it used to be that poet critics were the ones who did that level of theoretical thinking. So Sidney and Shelley and Coleridge and Dryden and Johnson and Eliot and Arnold and so on. But in the 20th century, once English studies becomes a respectable major in universities, I remember the first time I really understood how young a discipline English studies was. I was completely blown away, because you think, it's been around forever. But in the turn of the 20th century, nobody studied English in university. If you studied literature, it was Greek and Latin, and maybe literatures in modern languages. But English was considered, you don't need university study for that. That's ridiculous. You just do that on your own. But anyway, but once you have the rise of English studies or literary studies in the 20th century, that's not classics, the theoretical thinking about poetry gets taken over by theorists.
French ones.
Well,
among others.
Not only. I mean, Northrop Frye is one of the great theorists of poetry. But the problem is that poets don't really think about that stuff anymore. My experience in graduate school, one mistake I made when I first arrived is I didn't really plan what courses I was going to take very well. I'd really gotten into philosophy as an undergraduate, and one of my teaching assistants there had said, "Oh, you're really into Nietzsche? Well, you should read this guy Derrida. He's sort of a Nietzschean, acolyte." And I thought, okay. So then I saw this course in postmodern theory, and Derrida was on the reading list. I thought, this will be great. It was one of the most excruciating intellectual experiences I've ever had. Was this course we read, of grammatology, and we read Foucault's Archaeology of Knowledge, and we read Deleuze and Guattari, and we, all of that, like, really, really obscure, crabbed post-structuralist theory. And the import of a lot of it was, the author does not exist. Writing is all undermined by itself. Like everything that you would not want to teach a 24-year-old, 23-year-old aspiring poet was in that class. Like, it was just like designed to crush your spirit. it as a writer. And plus the writing was so bad. I remember at one point just raising my hand in the discussion and saying to the professor, I don't mean this flippantly, but can you tell me why is this stuff so badly written? Yeah. And everyone laughed, and the professor, looked sour. But
why haven't young Canadian critics articulated fundamental ideas about it?
Sure, I don't think it's a Canadian thing. It's just it's not something that poets see themselves as doing anymore. It's not something that most poets in the past thought of doing. It was really the job of certain poet critics, right? So Eliot or Arnold or Coleridge and so on. And so my point is there's nothing wrong with that. You can be a terrific critic without getting into theory. But my point is, why hand over theory to philosophers and theorists? Why can't, as poet critics or as poets, why can't we try our hand at this too? And you don't have to leap right into Derrida and Foucault, who aren't really writing about poetry anyway. You can write about, the main line of ideas about what poetry is and so on. One of the great mysteries to me in terms of Canadian literary or intellectual culture is why Canadian writers are not reading Charles Taylor.
Yeah, I was going to bring that up. He just won an award at the Blue Met last year.
Sure. Well, Charles Taylor is one of the great living philosophers,
and he's very interested in poetry.
And apparently he's writing a book now about poetry, which I am absolutely dying to read. Mm-hmm. But he's written a couple of terrific essays on Paul Celan, and
Heidegger influenced him too, right?
Yes, yeah. He's very much influenced by continental European philosophy,
and he's Canadian.
And he's an absolutely brilliant philosopher.
So can you summarize what he says about poetry?
Oh boy. Well, he's written more about language than poetry. I mean, one of the things I do in this essay is I relate some of his ideas about language to a theory of poetry. Essentially, his theory of language is an anti-enlightenment or counter-enlightenment theory. So, essentially, if you're talking about an enlightenment theory of language, a philosopher like John Locke, for instance, thinks of language as essentially designative. So, a word designates a thing in the world. This has been massively influential, and if you ask most people about what language is, they'll tell you something essentially like that you use a word to represent something, as though all language were a bunch of nouns that name things in the world. And that leaves it vulnerable to post-structuralists like Saussure, who come along and say, no, that it's arbitrary and blah, 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 and you get post-structuralist theory out of that. But what the counter-enlightenment thinkers like Hamann and Herder and Heidegger and ultimately Charles Taylor argue is, no, language is essentially, it's used to express thoughts and ideas. One of the things it can do is designate things in the world, but that's a very limited job. That what we use it for most of the time is to express our thoughts and feelings, and, much more importantly, to create new thoughts and feelings and modify our thoughts and feelings, and to create new social relationships. So, for example, if you say to somebody, will you marry me? And they say yes, you have just changed your social relationship, right? Or if a cop says you're under arrest, you have just changed your social relationship, right? And so language is actually affecting the world and making changes in the world. This is what he calls a sort of performative theory of language. Anyway, so there's much more to it, but if anybody wants to read his full version of this, he's got an amazing book called The Language Animal, but lots of smaller essays too. But anyway, so this naturally will produce a different theory of poetry. if you go beyond a strictly representative or mimetic idea of what language is. So my point is, Canadian poets should be reading Charles Taylor, and he's much clearer than reading Derrida or Foucault, by the way. You know, if you were a German poet or a French poet, it would be a matter of course that you would be reading all the great French philosophers and or German philosophers. Like, that's what you do if you're a poet. I think I mentioned Adam Zagajewski. He has this great essay. The title of the essay is "Young Poets, Please Read Everything." And he says, you know, when he came to America and he met American graduate students, he said, American graduate students only read poetry and criticism of poetry, and that's it. And he was completely astonished by that. He said, in Europe, if you're a poet, you read that stuff, but you also read fiction, you read philosophy, you read history, you read classics, you read everything. You read
science.
Said, right. And he says it's so limiting if all you're doing is reading poetry.
So you're suggesting that Charles Taylor was an important influence for you, and also Northrop Frye. And
yes.
I'll quote here. Mm-hmm. Frye, of course, is known for his theory of myths.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And the ultimate source of general truth about human concerns.
Mm-hmm.
That's what myths are. And the answer to the question, is this what happens, as opposed to what?
As opposed to what happened.
What happened, that's right. You make the difference. Mm-hmm. You differentiate those.
Sure. And
what happened is connected to authenticity and confession of individual poets. And so maybe you could clarify that.
Sure. So this originates in Aristotle's Poetics, where Aristotle makes a distinction between history and poetry. And he says history tells about what happened, and poetry tells about what happens. So there is a standard of truth for poetry for Aristotle, hence his mimetic theory. But does the poetry correspond to truth, right?
Right.
And he says yes, but you have to understand truth differently from the way a historian would. Is not what happened, it's what happens, the kind of thing that happens. Is this plausible? And
is it a general truth?
Sure. Or is it, right, is it, and this is where myth comes in. Myths are not histories. They're not stories about what happened at one time. Yeah. They're stories about what happens all the time.
And so that you can see it happening in your own life.
That's right. And and we have this, exactly, you can see it happening in your own life. And we have this, unfortunate colloquial use of the word myth to mean something that is untrue. That's just a myth. But the reality is myths are very true precisely because they're about the kind of thing that happens all the time, right? So the point I think I'm making about Frye at that point in the essay is that he's a mimetic theorist to the extent that he is concerned with how myths correspond to essential human concerns. He's also a pragmatic critic to some extent, in the sense of caring about, an ethical dimension. Anyway, the point is that what I'm saying about Frye is you can't pigeonhole him in terms of one particular, he's a pragmatist or a mimeticist or whatever. People like to say, oh, he's a myth critic, and dismiss him. That's out of date. There's this horrible thing in literary theory and criticism where there's some fashion that comes along, and then it gets superseded, supposedly, by some new fashion. And people talk about how, this is post whatever. The favorite word of literary theorists is post.
Yeah, right.
It's post that theory, and now there's a new theory that's come along, and there's no sense that there's anything valuable in that previous stuff. It's a kind of way of advancing your career and becoming the new thing, the new fashionable thing.
What you say is that the problem is that many poet critics today have forgotten Aristotle's distinction between what happened once and what happens always.
Sure.
Then you make the point that the poets that are striving for this sort of authenticity, I suppose, this confessional, personal catharsis or documentation of their experience. They abandoned metric verse.
Okay, so there's a number of things to unpack here. So first of all, if you look at the development of poetry since, say, Wordsworth, you can see that there's this progressive movement towards autobiography in poetry. So with Shakespeare and Milton and Chaucer, it's not autobiographical at all, except in, you could make an argument that maybe Shakespeare's sonnets are autobiographical in some sense, but the point of them is not autobiography. It has much more to do with innovations in the history of the sonnet sequence, and so on. Once you get to Wordsworth's Prelude, suddenly there's this possibility of, what Keats calls the egotistical sublime, right? The autobiographical poem. But even in the case of Wordsworth, you're dealing with autobiography that's been turned into myth. So the Prelude is a great myth as well as being autobiographical. What happens over time is once you get to, say the 1950s and the rise of Robert Lowell and Plath and Sexton and so on, and what follows them, the poets that come after, is you get this, with some poets, this is an argument that Adam Kirsch makes in his book called Something of the Modern. Anyway, he's an American poet critic. And he says, you get this kind of forgetting about the idea of the kind of thing that happens, and it becomes more and more about what happened, right? So It becomes more like history and less like myth. And as a result, you also get this idea that, what's important is to be true to the facts of one's experience. And this is what he calls authenticity, the poetry of authenticity. And here's where the problem comes in. If what's important above all is the facts of your experience, then rhetoric and prosody and technique writ large become impediments to the recording of your authentic experience. And so you get this disdaining of rhetoric. You look at what people say about rhetoric in the 1960s and 70s, it's like rhetoric is the worst thing in the world, rather than one of the essences of the art of poetry. And similarly, to get to your point about verse, meter and rhyme and anything other than free verse become suspicious as well, that somehow they're inauthentic, right? And so you get this sort of denigration of art and technique in the name of being authentic in terms of the facts of your experience. And this is what Kirsch identifies as a problem in American poetry, and one of the points I make in my essay is that there's a similar thing that happens in Canadian poetry at the same time.
In fact, you say masterful technique enables a poet to achieve deeper contemplation of moral political experience in poems and produces profound aesthetic pleasure. So how does it do that?
Technique?
Yeah.
Well, okay, so I think at that point I'm talking about Ivor Winters, I think, maybe.
Could be, yeah.
Just to give listeners an idea of what I'm doing in this essay, I'm taking up a number of about 4 different major ideas about what poetry is and what it's good for. Value, what's valuable in poetry. And I'm taking them up one by one and sort of extracting what I find most persuasive from each one and trying to synthesize them into a grand unified theory of poetry. Yeah. So I think at this point I'm looking at Ivor Winters, who had this really radical idea that technique is itself a matter of morality or of ethics. So he's sort of the opposite extreme from this poetics of authenticity that we're talking about, in which, it's immoral not for a poet not to be, a consummate craftsman or craftsperson, right? Artist. And I just want to be clear, by no means do I believe or feel that free verse is any less valuable than metrical verse. But what I would say is that what happens in free verse, if you look at the beginning of free verse with a poet like Whitman, look at what Whitman is doing. He's writing verse that sounds like the Old Testament prophets. He's translating ancient Hebrew poetic technique into English. And in particular, he makes up for the loss of rhythm that you get when you no longer have meter by making use of tremendous amounts of anaphora and syntactical parallelism and repetition of various kinds. In other words, he's
using technique.
Well, he's using
different
rhetoric.
Techniques.
He's using schemes.
Rhetorical
schemes. He's cranking them up to 11 to provide a rhythm that would be lacking otherwise because he doesn't have meter, right?
Yeah.
And so, as a result, his free verse tends to be, in most of his poetry, tends to be incredibly powerful, right? Yeah. So there's nothing wrong with free verse. The problem is, if your attitude is, well, rhetoric and meter are both impediments to telling it like it is.
From the gut, let's say.
Well, or just being true to the facts of what happened to you. Yeah. Then you're going to end up with something that doesn't have any rhythm, for example, right? You won't have any schemes, and you won't have any meter. So
what's wrong with that? What's wrong with that if it's a powerful piece of writing?
Well, what I'm saying is that it makes it weaker. If it works, if it's powerful, yes, I'm all for it. But I'm trying to explain what happens with poets who disdain meter, they disdain rhetoric. They say, okay, I'm just going to write without rhetoric, which is impossible to do. But they believe it's possible to do. I'm going to write without rhetoric, without meter. I'm just going to get rid of all those impediments and just tell it like it is. The problem is you end up with stuff that's pretty slack. There's very little energy to it. You don't have rhythm. You don't have sound effects. You have, the cliche about this is that it's chopped up prose, right? Well, the problem is good prose is full of these techniques, right? So it's not even good prose. It's just trying to do without technique, right? It's the opposite of the way Shakespeare learned how to write poetry. We don't know a lot about Shakespeare's life, but one of the things we do know is the nature of his education. And in Shakespeare's day, the way you learned how to write is you studied rhetoric and prosody, and in the case of drama, you studied stagecraft, and you learned technique from a very early age in far more detail than we learn it. Even learned scholars don't know as much rhetoric as a schoolboy in Shakespeare's day.
And what you say toward the end of this essay is that the critic must carefully respond to the poet's art and demonstrate precisely what technical means the poet uses to open up contact with a transcendental source.
Okay, so there I'm talking about it is a really long essay. So there I'm talking about.
But what you're doing is, as you say, you're sort of melding a whole range of important theories into something that informs your critical work.
Yes, sure. In the first instance, that I find persuasive, and that I can agree with. Right. I've just reread that essay in preparation for this interview, and I thought I still actually agree with all this.
That's good to know. So that's about 6 years ago or something like that.
Yeah,
maybe longer.
Sure. And so, but at that point in the argument, I'm talking about. Well, let me back up a little bit. One of the astonishing things I discovered when I was writing that thing is the ancient history of meter. I mean, if you go back to ancient India, right, like really, really old, ancient Sanskrit documents. I read this amazing book by an Italian writer named Roberto Calasso called Literature and the Gods. And he quotes this passage from an ancient Sanskrit religious document about meter. And this stuff is this is like thousands of years old. And at that time, meter was considered, it's almost shamanic, right? That the speaker of that little passage puts on meter like an animal skin in order to approach the fire. So, whereas in our day, you hear people talking about meter as this, that they love to use the word form, and they love to they talk about it as this kind of dry, thing that you do to a poem, that you pour it into this, like, you're putting a suit on it, and you're making it stiff, and like that is the exact opposite of the origin of meter, which is a shamanic thing. It allows you to approach the fire, right? Mm-hmm. And so
without getting killed,
right? Exactly. That this is a sublime experience, right? Mm-hmm. It's a technology for encountering the gods.
Well,
right?
It's funny, that puts me in mind of Odysseus. They had to strap him to the mast.
Sure.
But he wanted to listen to the sirens without being,
without being killed
by him.
Exactly. So when that I found really exciting. One of the things I say at that point in the essay is that it fits with my own experience of writing metrical verse. I want to be clear to listeners that I write in free verse. I write in meter. It's all good. So I don't have an axe to grind about how meter is somehow better than free verse. However, my experience of writing verse in meter is not unlike what those ancient Indians are talking about, in the sense that if I'm trying to write something and it doesn't fit with the meter or the rhyme scheme, I have to write something else. And when you're first learning how to write in meter, you tend to write something worse than you were intending to say for the sake of the rhyme and the meter.
Yeah.
But with experience, you get so that you immediately cancel out those options, and you try to write something better than what you originally thought of. Mm-hmm. And when you're writing, at sort of a white heat, and you're in the zone, and you're composing quickly, and you've got your dictionaries and your thesauruses, and you're sort of moving. The experience for me is it's like there's a muse or a god or a better poet, let's say, whispering in my ear, like, no, try this, try something better. Here's a better option.
They're forcing you to be better.
That's right. And so that by the time I'm finished, I read it over and I go, wow, that's so surprising. I didn't even intend to say that, but it's so much better than I had originally intended, right?
Right.
So when you think of meter that way, it's incredibly exciting and empowering. So when
it's like
I go from
God talking through you.
Sure,
if that's how you want to put it.
Sure, or you're the unconscious, or the duende, or it doesn't have to be a mystical experience. It can be however you want to think of it, but it's not conscious, right? It's not your intellect writing it. So when I go from that experience and that way of thinking about it, and then I hear somebody talking about form as this tired, outdated kind of old-fashioned. They often associate it for some reason with conservative politics, which I find completely bizarre.
Yeah.
So but it is important, for me as a teacher to meet my students where they're coming from. So it's important for me to really try to understand where they're getting these ideas, and to try to meet them, where they are, and try to encourage them to see this stuff differently.
Okay, can you summarize your all-encompassing theory of poetry in a few short sentences?
Oh,
please?
Boy.
I think you talk about 5 poetic values.
Sure. Well, the first thing I would say is that for me, aesthetic value is primary. So, in other words, if I agree with the political ideas of the poem, or the ethical, moral teachings of the poem, or whatever, that's not good enough, right? It's got to work as a work of art, right? So my first principle is that poetry is an art, and it gives pleasure.
But your art might not give me pleasure. It's not connected necessarily. Pleasure and art, I mean, they should go hand in hand, but they don't go hand in hand for everyone.
Well, now, sure. Now, there you're talking about what we were talking about earlier in relationship to Robert Frost, right? That I try to encourage my students to have a certain humility. If they're not getting it, if they're not getting pleasure out of Shakespeare or Frost or whoever, I try to encourage them to try again, right? I give them some ways of, reading the meter, for instance, or whatever.
Yeah.
And my students, so in my Shakespeare classes, my students will often say, when I read this before class, I didn't really get it. It was kind of boring. It's really hard. I have to keep looking up the footnotes. But then when we did some of the performance stuff where someone's really getting into it emotionally, I get it. Yeah. Right? So my point is that if somebody is not getting pleasure out of something that everyone else seems to, or many people seem to be getting pleasure out of, right? Yes.
Yeah.
Then it could be a matter of, you just haven't figured out how to read that poet yet.
So
anyway,
pleasure.
Sure.
Then moral sources, human truth, performative power, contact with something higher and deeper than the self.
Sure. So these are all derived from historically important theories of poetry and what's valuable in poetry. So the mimetic tradition thinks of poetry as corresponding to truth. The phrase I use there, human truth, owes something probably to Samuel Johnson's reading of Shakespeare, in which he says, the greatness of Shakespeare is that he's true to human nature. The point is, throughout history, people have developed these theories of what poetry does. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, in Sidney, in the Defense of Poesy, he argues that poetry is a medicine of cherries, that you have this moral lesson you're trying to teach, and you sweeten it with cherry syrup or something to make the medicine go down, so that it's pleasurable for the end of moral teaching. With a poet like Horace, on the other hand, his poems are didactic. He's teaching things.
Yeah.
He's teaching moral lessons in the poems. But you don't really get the sense that that's the point, right? The real point seems to be pleasure. He's giving you a moral lesson for the purpose of giving you pleasure if you take pleasure in learning. So, in other words, for a younger reader who doesn't care about these moral questions so much, he has a certain kind of poem. But if he's writing for a middle-aged or an older reader who has thought, a Stoic philosopher or something who's thought deeply about morality or political morality in the Roman Empire or something, they might be a little bored with something that does not engage moral questions, and so he wants to provide them with stimulation and pleasure, right? Mm-hmm. So there's sort of two sides of a coin in terms of the hierarchy of pleasure or moral teachings, right?
Yeah.
But one of the things I do in there is I bring in Charles Taylor on moral sources. So for him, it's not so much a matter of teaching a lesson, what's the moral of the story, which we tend, with modern readers, we tend to, the hair goes up on the back of our necks, and we resist that. For him, he talks about it in terms of resonating with a source of value, right? So that if we read a work of literature or of poetry and we feel, so the example I give is Rilke's poem Archaic Torso of Apollo, where the you in the poem encounters this statue. The statue seems to become inhabited by the god, and then you feel yourself seen by the god, and so you have this moral imperative: you must change your life, right? Mm-hmm. Now, there's no content of how you must change your life, because that's not the point. It's not the moral lesson. Okay, you must, stop lying or something. It's the experience, the resonant experience of having been seen by the divine, and being convinced that you must change your life. So that's an example of, I think, of what Taylor means by this, poetry as a source of, as a moral source.
You're saying that great poetry has to contain this.
Yeah, I wouldn't go so far as to say that it has to. Different kinds of poems do different things. King Lear or Macbeth resonate on a moral level in a way that, I don't know, A Midsummer Night's Dream might not. But A Midsummer Night's Dream is just as great a play. I'm not trying to argue that all great poems have to do all of these things. I'm just saying that all of these values are ways of making, if you take them into account and you satisfy these things that people look for in poetry, truth to human nature, resonance with moral sources, aesthetic pleasure, a connection with, something deeper or higher than the self, etc. These things tend to, if they're successful, tend to produce a feeling of excitement and euphoria and pleasure and joy in a reader,
which motivates you to read more.
Sure.
Yeah.
And so the point I'm making, I think, there is that I want Canadian poets to be ambitious and shoot for the moon, right?
Yeah.
To really go for greatness.
At the end of the piece, you talk about the absence of a major poetic figure in Canada, and therefore the self of every Canadian has not been fully formed.
Yeah.
That's quite a dramatic statement.
Well, this comes out of the what Taylor calls performative poetics, that element that, just as language changes social relationships, the cop says you're under arrest, or your beloved says yes, I'll marry you, or whatever, that changes reality.
Everything.
Changes social reality. Poetry can do something similar. I argue against Auden's line about poetry makes nothing happen. I mean, I realize Auden is much more complicated than this. This is a sort of simplified version of, but
he's goading, I think.
Sure. Shakespeare has influenced many writers since Shakespeare, right? And those writers, in turn, have influenced,
No, absolutely. I agree, the literary tradition, but I'm talking about your average Joe on the street. First of all, the number of people that really care about Shakespeare or poetry. And that's the point I wanted to make at the beginning, was that, in terms of the number of people in Canada who are serious about reading poetry, maybe 4,000 people, 5,000, I think that number has been thrown around.
Yeah. Whenever somebody raises this, I always think of the fact that, how many people read John Donne when he was, handwriting his poems and passing them around to his friends, right? We're talking about a really small readership. Sure, How many people could read in Dante's day, right? So the numbers of people are not the point. Is what I would say.
It's the impact it has
on the culture, and also over time, right? It's not just what's happening now; it's what happens in the coming centuries and so on. What I'm doing there is I'm arguing against the idea that poetry is just this kind of meaningless pastime that it's marginal, it's not important to our culture or society, it's just this thing that a few crazy people do. I'm arguing against that and saying that if you just look at cultural history, all you have to do is read cultural history and understand that that's just not true, and it's an illusion to believe that. It's just an ignorance thing. But you can of course really understand why people would think that, right? Poetry is not something that we read about on the internet all the time. It's not part of everyday experience. But, language is part of everybody's everyday experience. And Stéphane Mallarmé said that the social role of the poet is, as he puts it, to purify the language of the tribe. Language has this principle of entropy. It's continually turning into cliche. It's always solidifying and dying.
Things
That's
to
right.
habit.
Just listen to journalism. right? It's cliche after cliche after cliche. And these are good journalists.
And after a while, you just tune it out.
Yeah, and you don't even notice it, and you don't realize what's happening to the language. Well, the job of poetry, in a social sense, is to prevent that from happening, or to revive it, to keep the language alive so that it doesn't turn into these cliches. And there's a political dimension to that, too, that, look at what happened to Spanish under Franco. The word father, papa, gets so associated with Franco. I mean, read Spanish poetry before Franco. Lorca and Miguel Fernandez and all those great Spanish poets. And then read Spanish poetry after Franco. I mean, yes, it's being repressed and Lorca's being shot and all of that, but it's also what's happening to the language. The political oppression is oppressing. Yes, it's oppressing the language. It's turning the language into this oppressive thing, and it's the job of this is precisely why in a totalitarian regime, under Stalin, for example, why was Stalin so obsessed with Mandelstam? He's just some guy writing poems. To us in North America, that seems bizarre. Why would the leader be so obsessed with some poet? It's because the poet is resisting the corruption of the language. Right? Yeah. So Stalin was obsessed, with the poets. That's why he sent Mandelstam to the Gulag. Right?
Well, that's why Plato wanted to ban them.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not a new story, right? It's just that we tend to forget all that. We have cultural amnesia. And so to us, poets are these marginal figures who, they only sell 200 copies of their book and they rely on subsidy. Like, there's all this totally ignorant argument about the pointlessness of poetry that just flabbergasts me, because it just is totally unaware of the whole history of poetry under totalitarian regime. I mean, one of I think before the interview, you were talking about this Czech novelist Ivan Klima. And when I was in Prague, almost 20 years ago now, 15 years ago, Klima was there, and a bunch of other Czech writers, and they were all talking about samizdat culture under the communists in Prague and the Prague Spring and all of that stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, where it was illegal to publish, but they just typed it out and circulated it amongst themselves.
And since then, the Iron Curtain had fallen, and they'd had 10 or so years of capitalism and democracy and so on. And they were talking in sort of nostalgic terms about how poetry used to be so central to everybody's life. People would get up in the morning and, spend all morning trying to find the latest samizdat magazine or whatever. And nowadays, people they've said nowadays people just want to read like trashy novels and watch TV and right. And, so they were sort of longing for that golden age when poetry was more central to the culture. And, and I certainly would not want to live under a totalitarian system, don't get me wrong. Mm-hmm. But I'm just saying that when people really need poetry is when things get tough, right? Then they realize how important it is, to survival. So the other example I give my students is what the Holocaust survivors say about what it was like in the concentration camps. Mm-hmm. Somebody would arrive, a new, boxcar load of people would arrive at the concentration camp, and all the people in the camp would run out to the new people, and they'd say, what poems do you know? What songs do you know? Have you memorized? And then they would tell them, and then they would memorize them. And then they would tell the other people in the camp, so that they could have a culture, that this was what they were holding on to, so they wouldn't despair. So even in the concentration camp, poetry becomes the really important
not even
thing.
Even especially
exactly
because it's about survival.
Yeah, it's what keeps them sane, right? And people who've been in solitary confinement under in prisons and so on say the same thing. It's poetry. It's the verses. It's the Mother Goose rhymes. It's the national anthems. The songs that they memorize. The poems they were forced to memorize in school. Those are the things that keep them from losing their minds.
Well, from that, let's move to the practical application of criticism. And that's another piece that you've written in You Are Here, Essays on the Art of Poetry in Canada, published by Porcupine's Quill, in which you say that if there are no effective standards of quality, or these standards are kept secret, then poets can't tell the difference between their good poems and their bad. That speaks to what? Honest critics.
Sure. I wrote this, one of the essays in the book is this long essay on Eric Ormsby's poetry. Once it was published, he read it and he wrote me this really kind letter. And one of the things I remember him saying is, I wish somebody had written this 20 years ago. Because, in that essay, I'm full of praise for his poetry, but I also am tough on some of his poems. And, his response to that is, geez, I wish somebody had told me earlier so I could have revised them or cut them out. Yeah. And the opposite of that, Anne Carson, in her Paris Review essay, says, at first, when she was first trying to get published, she couldn't get anything published. Then, this incredible story of getting discovered by Guy Davenport and all that happened. And she became overnight had this meteoric rise of fame. And she says, she was complaining in the interview, she said, and now nobody will say anything bad about it. Yeah. It's all good. Mm-hmm. And it drove her crazy, and she says, people just don't want to think. They just want to be told this is good. Mm-hmm. So that, okay, now we can enjoy it. And the problem is that that's not good for the poet. Those are poets who publish lots and lots of books and they're well known and so on, but it's true for beginning poets too. There's this there's this controversy that about involving was it Michael Lista and Jan Zwicky and all of that stuff about native reviewing and all that. And one of the arguments that people made is, well, you have some new poet who just published the first book. Nobody's ever heard of them before. Why should you lambaste them in your review and tell them, this is not working, and there's one good poem or something? Yeah,
it's better to deflate overinflated reputations than to dump on a poor poet.
And then what the advice is, you should just ignore them. Well, I mean, a new poet who's published first of all, the editor should probably never have published the thing in the first place, right? That's another question. But so if somebody's published a mostly bad book, and there might be a poem or two that's pretty good. I just had the experience. I reviewed some books of poetry for the Literary Review of Canada, and there was a book like this. And if you just ignore it, the person's they're not getting any honest feedback, right? Their parents tell them it's great. Mm-hmm. Their editor says, oh, this is good. And their friends say, oh, it's really good. So then they just keep writing at that level for their whole careers. And they never write anything any good. Well, I mean, why is that the thing that people want, right?
And that's what you say is the case for quite a few supposedly renowned great Canadian poets.
Sure.
I mean, that's been your experience. Why have they been
He tells them, that's right. And once they get a certain amount of institutional power and so on, then no one is ever going to tell them that something is not working. I mean, and that is destructive to the literary culture.
It's just look at Michael's experience. He's left
Michael
poetry.
Lista.
He was an honest critic, and look where that got him.
I don't know.
Look where he went. He left.
Yeah.
He could have stayed, obviously.
Yeah. It's a great loss. When I was listening, I found out about it by listening to your interview with him. And it's a gain for journalism, but, I hope he comes back. I hope he comes back to poetry and criticism at some point.
There's way more people writing poetry than critiquing it, and that's a problem.
It's the same in the United States. I mean, I met Joshua Megan at a poetry conference several years ago, and we were talking about this, and he said, so I was talking about this in the Canadian context,
Mm-hmm.
and he said, well, who's writing good poetry criticism in America? And I was like, yeah, I see your point. I mean, there are a few. I mentioned Adam Kirsch, and everybody mentions William Logan.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
But there are far, far more books of poetry published every year than reviewers or critics of them.
Well, the joke is there's more writers than readers.
Right. And that's not healthy. And most books get ignored,
Mm-hmm.
right? So if you're a young poet who's published a first book, and most of it's not very good, and there are one or two promising poems or good poems in there, and a critic comes along and says, most of this is not good, here's why, right? That's important. Not just this is not good, dismiss it, but you explain in detail what the problems are.
That's right. But that's your here's why. Someone else might have a here's why for why it's good.
Yeah, and may the best argument win, right? It's up to the poet.
Problem is there aren't enough people to
True.
For that debate to take place.
Some people get lucky and they have multiple reviewers. But anyway, but if a reviewer comes along and says, okay, here's what I find weak or problematic or whatever about some of these poems in very specific terms, being very precise, and talking about alternate choices the person might have made, the poet might have made, and then, okay, here are some poems, or here's a poem that's working better. Then the person, the poet, can read that and say, oh, okay, do I agree with this or not? If I agree with it, then...
Or I didn't think of that.
Yeah,
I never thought of that.
Right. I may not have even heard of these rhetorical techniques or whatever.
In fact, that's what you say here. You say good criticism can help poets see what the gods are doing in their work.
Well, yeah, that's... Yeah.
Underlying, and also point out underlying relationships among poems that they may not have known were there. Sure,
and that applies to even, very strong poets. I mean, one of the things that's true of poetry as an art is that it's not entirely conscious,
mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is true of many art forms, that you are aware of what you're doing technically, or you ought to know what you're doing technically, ideally, but you might not know what's happening on an unconscious level in terms of displaced myth or imagery or symbolism or themes or whatever. And so, I've had poets write to me after they've read my essay on their work, and they've said, gee, I didn't realize I was doing that.
Yeah.
Thank you for pointing that out.
Yeah.
Somebody just objectifies and clarifies for them what they've been doing all this time. And that kind of critical assessment of one's earlier work, whether it comes from a critic or yourself, is absolutely essential for the development of a poet. And one of the problems that we've had in Canada is you have pretty good poets, or even quite strong poets, who don't manage to get to the next level of major poet, or let alone great poet. And why is that? Well, it's partly, I would argue, because you don't have great critics who will, not just say, oh, this is great, thank you, next book, please. That's not helpful to a poet who's at that level of, let's say somebody who's a technical master, who's been developing up to a certain point, who has some excellent poems and some poems that are not working, they're at the level where they need a reader who is extremely well read and knowledgeable to respond to them. They don't need somebody saying, okay, there's some good poems in the book and some that are not so great. They need somebody to follow their whole development and say, okay, this is what I'm seeing. And the poet might not see exactly the same thing, but they'll be able to engage with that critical reading and say, oh, I now understand the direction that I've been moving in, and Now I know what to do next.
And to put it in Canadian terms, it's like a hockey team that maybe is only playing its opponents that are at a certain level.
Sure.
They don't get the very best in the world to play against.
Yes.
So they can't hone their skills and become the best.
Yeah, that's a great metaphor. Yeah. And so that's, back to the point about, where's the Canadian Whitman or Dickinson? Yeah. Well, I mean, no. Granted, Emily Dickinson didn't have
no, she was pretty isolated.
But she did have some readers, and there's this, more and more critics.
What about Whitman? Did he have great critics, and did he even listen to them?
Well, Emerson.
Okay.
Emerson was his great reader, and he, Emerson basically said, "Yes, you are on the right track. Mm-hmm. Keep going." And Emily Dickinson, we think of her as being completely isolated, but she had this friend who read everything she wrote, and I bet there was a lot of really good criticism going on in there that we just don't know about because it was all spoken. Criticism is important to poets at the amateur level and at the level of near greatness too.
It's as you say, it's sort of part of an ecosystem that you read. It's so important.
Sure.
Symbiotic.
Yeah, and it takes an enormous effort on the part of the critic to read a poet at that level, right?
Well, and plus it takes a huge amount of time.
Yeah. And
of course there aren't any resources. They're not paid to do this.
Well, you can make a few $100s or something if you're lucky.
Yeah.
But when I finished that essay on Ormsby, I was completely exhausted.
It's a mammoth enterprise.
Yeah.
It's terrific too.
But you do. I mean, one of the things you get out of it as a critic is you learn from that experience, right? So if you're a poet and a critic, you're doing this partly to further your own education, right? You're trying to follow the development of a poet and see, okay, these are the choices they made in their career, and you can think about what you're doing in your own work in relationship to that.
You followed his career, and you followed all his different collections, and mm-hmm. one of the things that I appreciated was, this is the advice you give a critic, is to quote the poem in full wherever you can. Yeah. So you did a lot of that in the essay on Ormsby. You've written articles on Daryl Hine, mm-hmm. who interestingly is a Canadian who moved to the States at a fairly early age. Mm-hmm. Dennis Lee, who you're somewhat critical of, Anne Carson, who you're not, Jeffrey Donaldson, who you really admire, mm-hmm. Marlene Cookshaw, Karen Soley, and Eric Ormsby. Mm-hmm. Why don't we just, after all of this conversation, as opposed to going deep into Ormsby's oeuvre, perhaps what we could do is you could try and apply what we've been talking about mm-hmm. To his poetry. Can you do that in a fairly concise fashion?
Yeah. So one of the things I love about Ormsby's poetry is this is a guy who really knows what he's doing technically. His poems sound fantastic. Mm-hmm. They're full of assonance and consonance and alliteration and meter and rhyme and syntax and the guy just really knows what he's doing technically speaking, in terms of rhetoric and prosody.
It sounds really great in the mouth.
Yeah. And that in itself already puts him head and shoulders above many, many other poets. Mm-hmm. I also love his very self-aware engagement with the history of poetry. So his early books, his early poems are largely Dinggedichte, or thing poems, that learn a lot from Rilke and Marianne Moore and D.H. Lawrence and maybe Francis Ponge and Paul Claudel, about how you observe some object or animal or plant and describe them and transform them through metaphor and other tropes into something else, through magic. It's a kind of
Something
verbal
else
magic.
Into what?
Well, in his case, over and over again, he transforms the objects of his perception into decaying, erotic, divine things. And why that is has a lot to do.
Too.
Suffering, yes. Suffering, often bruised or tortured or, damaged things that are also erotic and also divine in some way. And he looks at them with a kind of obsessiveness, a kind of fetishistic obsessiveness. Why does he do that? Well, as he says in his interview with Carmine Starnino,
where is that interview?
It's in a collection. Yeah, there's a collection of interviews of older Canadian poets by younger Canadian poets. I think Tim Bowling edited it. I forget what it's called. Something like Where the Words Come From or something like that. But anyway, so he says that a colleague of his said, "Why do you keep writing about fungus and plants? Why don't you write about something important like your failed marriage?" And he says, "I was writing about my failed marriage, but I was writing about it by writing about these things," right? So Ormsby is very self-consciously trying to do something different from autobiographical, confessional, poetry of authenticity, whatever you want to call it. Because he's a bit later than Plath and Lowell and so on. He's trying to do something new. And he does that by reaching back to something older, Rilke and Moore and Lawrence, and he realizes that there was a kind of disservice done to Ormsby's poetry and its reception because people sort of dismissed it as it's just description, but it's not just description. It's he does what Rilke does and what Moore does. He transforms these objects into emblems of the self.
Well, into emotion and feeling.
Yes,
too,
yeah,
right?
yeah. And they're incredibly good, powerful poems that are, you know that there's something deeply emotional going on in them.
But you don't unless you've read quite a few of them. If you only read a few of them, then you can have that impression.
Yeah, and this is what I say, that every poet, you have to learn how to read every poet. So even though you might read a poem or two by a poet and think, oh, that's clear, I get it, I understand it. It doesn't mean you really get that poet. It doesn't necessarily mean you've really learned how to read that poet. You have to read everything they've written and all their prose and their, read criticism of them and so on. And you get deeper and deeper. But so Ormsby is engaged with literary tradition in a very creative way. He's a technical master, not to say all the time. Sometimes he falters, but most of his poetry is incredibly skilled. He is getting at truths of human nature. He is in touch with something deeper than himself. He calls it his daemon, Daemon, which is something I talk about in this essay, and he describes this in his interview with Carmine too. He's extraordinary in that how many poets nowadays who are technical masters do you hear talk about hearing voices from their daemon?
Yeah.
Right? Like, we tend to think of, like, Allen Ginsberg, he's in touch with the spirits or something, and on the other hand, you have Auden or somebody who's all about technique, but we don't think of them combined in a single poet. Well, why is that? Milton, heard the muse, and he was a technical master. So there's no reason that you can't combine them in a single poet. So one of the things I find attractive and interesting about Ormsby is he's well aware that that technique and inspiration are perfectly compatible. I also admire his development. I mean, he jokes in that interview with Carmine about how he starts with lichen and moss and works his way up through baboons and hyenas to human beings. But, it's true. There's a real development. You can see where he goes on writing thing poems a bit too long, and you can tell he's sort of getting bored. And then he starts, but he resists that. He's like, I'm not going to keep doing this. I'm spinning my wheels. Yeah. I'm going to learn something new. And he tries I think it's Daybreak at the Straits, he tries a whole bunch of things, some of which works great, some of which is a kind of a mess. And then his next book is Araby, which is a masterpiece. And where does that come? Like, it's not about things, it's about these two characters.
No, it's based on his Islamic scholarship, isn't it?
Yes,
to some extent?
yes. I mean, he wouldn't have been able to write that without that background. But, it's much more than that. It's not a dry, researched thing by any means. It's this dramatic sequence of poems often spoken by these extraordinary characters. And it's just a great book, but it's completely different from what he started out doing, even though there are still vestiges of what he's... So, for instance, there's this poem, Junkyard Vision, or something like that, in which he describes all of these, like, auto parts, not unlike the way he does in the Thing poems, except this is in a much more complex, dramatic monologue, elegy, character situation. Like, there's a lot of things, new things going on in there that were not there in the earlier poems. So he's a poet who develops in very interesting ways. And so, there's a lot to like in that. And it's very rewarding for a critic to be able to follow what he's doing. And especially, as I say, if you're a poet yourself, to really get intimate with the artistic choices that somebody's made over the course of a decades-long career.
A career that, at least, it didn't start till he was, 50?
Well, that's
the
other thing.
Yeah.
I mean, my first book of poems was not published until I was 43 or something. When you're going through that apprenticeship that's going on and on, it's when you encounter a poet like Ormsby, who had a similarly, in his case, a really even longer, truly epic apprenticeship, it helps you see, it's just, you have to be patient, you have to be persistent. There's no one right moment to reach your maturity. It depends on your individual identity or temperament or path. Yeah. And it's not like he wasn't doing anything in those years.
No.
He was getting...
accomplished librarian.
Sure, getting all these degrees and, developing a career. Someday I want to read his biography and find out what happened to him in his 20s. There's this period where he didn't get his undergraduate degree till he was 30.
Well, that's where some of this pain and suffering came from.
Well, he writes about the place he's got this prose piece called "The Place of Shakespeare in a House of Pain," which is about his childhood in Florida, this sort of Southern Gothic, childhood. And
it's interesting. He's born in America. I mean, he's Canadian, but and we are in America right now, and you're Canadian.
Yes.
So how does that work?
Well, how does it work? I mean,
does this give you? First of all, are you committed to being a critic of Canadian poetry for the next number of years?
Sure, that seems to be where I'm most useful, I think.
And you're here because of work?
I'm here because I'm married and American. We met in graduate school. I'm here because we both have academic jobs here in the States, and I've applied for positions in Canada, but there are not very many positions available, and there are a lot of applicants. So, I would love to write about poets other than Canadians, and I do sometimes, but that seems where
you mean
where
I'm forced useful. To write about Canadian
poets?
No.
I what I mean is that's where I seem to be drawn somehow in terms of usefulness, right? And, I mean, Les Murray, the Australian poet, he does this. He writes about Australian poets because clearly he can see that Australian poetry needs good critics. That's where I see some use to what I'm doing. But I've written about I've got a piece about Rilke and some other things too.
So perhaps if you continue to work hard as a critic of Canadian poetry, then you'll be responsible for the first truly great Canadian poet.
Well, that's not really up to the critic, it's up to the poet. Yeah, I don't know about that. But I think what we need is not just one critic, we need lots of critics. And fortunately, we do have a whole bunch of, I want to say young critics, but I guess a lot of us are sort of getting in the middle age at this point. But,
name some.
Carmine Starnino and Jason Guriel and Michael Lista and Zach Wells and Robin Serra and Anita Leahy and Mary Dalton just published a book. There's a whole bunch of people who are writing. And I have to say, this is really, the books exist because of Carmine. Mm-hmm. He's got this incredible vision of a whole bunch of books of Canadian poetry criticism, and he
also
edits most
thanks
of
to
them.
Tim Inkster too.
Yes, Tim Inkster, and I think they're publishing a number of these at Biblioasis. And
true,
and
they
Carmen's
did.
Most
they did
recent,
Zach Wells, I think.
Sure, and Carmen's most recent book came out with Lazy Bastardism. Is the book.
Yes, at Gasbro Press.
Gasbro Press, right? So that's very heartening to see. That stuff didn't really exist back in the 80s and 90s. I remember when I was in at York, bewildered and confused and disheartened and, wondering what was going on in Canadian literature and not understanding. And I came across this little book by John Metcalf called... It wasn't Kicking Against the Pricks. It was the one after that.
Okay.
And, he had this wonderful essay on Alice Munro's Walker Brothers Cowboy, her story. And I thought, this guy is such a good critic. And he's got this attitude of, like, honesty, And I was like, this is what we need. Mm-hmm. I was an undergraduate, and so I needed to get an education and all of that. But, see, the way I got started writing criticism is... I was reading a biography of Rilke, and I noticed that Rilke spent a lot of time publishing reviews, and I thought I could do that. So I thought, okay, I'm gonna find a book to write a review of. So I just did a little research, and I found this anthology called The New Canon. Edited by Carmine.
That's in
so that's the first review I wrote.
Yeah.
And so I wrote a review of it, and I thought it was great. It was exciting. I was like, who is this guy? Like, this guy, I get where he's coming from. Like, I feel what he's doing. Mm. And so it was a, pretty celebratory review, although I, have some caveats and so on. But so the thing was published online, I think, and my wife and I had just gotten back from Ethiopia, where we adopted our son, and he was ill on the plane, and so we were in Chicago, and he was at the Children's Hospital, and I was staying in a Ronald McDonald house, and I was late for my first class teaching, and I couldn't get into my email, and finally I got into my email in the middle of the night, and there was this email from Carmine saying, hey, I read your review of my anthology. I thought it was great. Would you be interested in writing reviews for books in Canada? And I was like, yeah, of course I would. That'd be fantastic. And so then he assigned me the Marlene Cookshaw stuff. So that's where that essay came from. And I think I had already started reading the Anne Carson book, which also appeared online too. There's a picture of me in Ethiopia, standing next to the hut where our son was born, and I'm holding a copy of Anne Carson's book, Decreation, which is really bizarre because it's like, what is that doing there? And my wife was kidding me about it. Like, you can't even stop. You can't even stop with the poetry stuff while we're doing this. But anyway, so that's how it sort of got started, and then Carmine got me in touch with some other editors, and so I started writing some other things. But the way I tend to like to work is I like to get all the books of a poet and read their entire career up to that point. And I realize I'm really lucky to have had some editors willing to publish those things, especially in Canadian Notes and Queries. They give you all kinds of space.
They do, yeah.
They let you quote entire poems. And
is that Emily Donaldson?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, Zach Wells was the reviews editor for a while at the time. Yeah. And so I love that. And I've done some other things that are, been assigned or have a limited space or whatever. And
what are you working on now?
I am writing a long poem. I noticed in your interviews that Michael, Lista, and Jason Guriel are also writing long poems. I wonder
funny,
what that's about.
I don't know what it is.
It's the zeitgeist.
Yeah.
But one of the poems in my book of poems is about 21 pages long. Mm-hmm. So it's not the first long poem I've written. But yeah, at this point it's about 40 pages long, and it's set at the University of Oxford, and it involves architecture and angels and demons and the muses and lots
Ruskin.
of...
You got any Ruskin in there?
Yeah, there's Ruskin. It's lots of the writers and critics and poets who lived at or visited or studied at Oxford, which includes almost everybody.
Sure,
even Keats. He wrote a lot of Endymion at Oxford. So at this point I have the whole campus memorized, and there are some Canadians there too, Northrop Frye, Robertson Davies, and others.
What about criticism? You working on anything?
Well, I not at the moment. I wrote a long essay about Elise Partridge when her collected poems came out from the New York Review of Books Poets series.
When was that?
That appeared in Canadian Notes and Queries a year or two ago. It was in their film issue. I think it was issue 99. And then I wrote a thing on a few books that were published by McClellan and Stewart for Literary Review of Canada. And I wrote a long thing on a ridiculously long essay on one book by Jim Johnstone. The book is called The Chemical Life. It's supposed to be forthcoming in Hamilton Arts and Letters. And I've written a few other things about the Hine book and so on that are online. But in terms of critical enterprises, I don't know. I've got some ideas. I'm thinking of maybe proposing another Essential Poets volume with, because I did the Daryl Hine one with Porcupine's Quill. I've got a couple ideas for those. Someday I would like to edit an anthology of Canadian poetry. But
I was expecting that actually, because no one's done it the right way yet.
I've had a couple of people talk to me about teaming up to do that, and I'm just not sure the time is right for me. Mm-hmm. And the other thing is, I promised myself I'm not going to take on anything big until I get this poem written. Sure. It's about 40 pages long, and it looks like it's going to be much longer than that, which is ridiculous. Who wants to read a poem that long?
I just read the Odyssey. So.
Yeah, there you go. So it's going to be what it's going to be, but that's what I'm immersed in now.
Great.
The other thing I'm doing is, I mentioned to you before our interview, I teach Canadian literature, one of the things I do at my college, and I'm very excited because I'm taking this course, which has been a kind of cultural studies course on Canadian literature. We use literature to talk about Canadian identity and imperialism and the psychology of the colonial, all stuff like that. But I'm turning that into a course which reads Canadian literature, as works of art. Mm-hmm. And I'm so excited to do that, and I'm discovering there is so much good stuff out there. But it's not necessarily the things you read in a typical Canadian literature course, because Canadian literature has often been taught in terms of what's important, what's significant, what's influential, not necessarily what's really good writing. So, for instance, one of my favorite books of Canadian prose is a book by John Glasgow called Memoirs of Montparnasse, which is widely considered to be the greatest book about Paris in the 1920s and the writers there. It's better than A Movable Feast. It's better than Morley Callahan's book and so on. It was reissued by the New York Review of Books series in a beautiful volume, and it's so good. But who's going to put that on the Canadian literature course? It's not really about Canada.
No.
In the first
But
two
hey,
pages,
it's by a Canadian.
right?
Yeah.
But it's just a terrific book. I mean, that's Canadian literature, right?
Totally.
So I want a course where my students are saying, this stuff is so good.
Well, it's
Right?
like you're putting your anthology together for that.
Well,
course.
right. Yeah. I'm also really excited about teaching Canadian poetry in that course in this poetry and performance kind of a way, where I have students memorizing
that's wonderful.
and reciting Canadian, really good Canadian poems.
Mm-hmm.
So I think teaching that is going to help me imagine an anthology of Canadian poetry. But someday I would like to edit that volume. We'll see what happens. But I think it's important to do it right, and that takes an enormous amount of time. I was just reading Northrop Frye's review of A.J.M. Smith's book of Canadian poetry that came out in like 1943. And Frye,
an anthology, was it?
Anthology, yeah, really, important anthology. And Frye says, unlike previous anthologists of Canadian poetry, who just basically recycle what previous anthologists have done to save time, Smith actually went out and read everything.
Well, he could back then. He could.
Well, right, yeah.
You can't do that anymore.
That's true. That's one of the things that's prevented this from happening.
Yeah.
There's a pretty good anthology. Brian Traherne from McGill edited
20th century.
1920 to 1960.
Yeah.
And I've been exploring that anthology, and one of the comments I make a couple times in my book is, where are the good Canadian anthologies? I wish I'd known about his book. I don't know why I didn't know.
Yeah.
It's crazy, but it's a pretty good anthology. I haven't read the whole thing, but
it leaves open 1960 to the present.
well, right, and that's one of the problems is there's just so much, and this is why Carmen's got the right idea. What you need is a bunch of good critics publishing books in which they respond to all this stuff, so that an anthologist can know where to begin.
Yeah.
Of course, you have to make your own judgments, but you can't just wade into the 80,000 volumes of poetry. There's no time. So,
we'll look forward to that, even if it does take a long time.
Yeah. Thank you, Nigel.
Thank you, James.
Thanks for a great conversation.
I've been speaking with James Pollock, who is the editor of a forthcoming... is the author of You Are Here, Essays on the Art of Poetry in Canada, published by Porcupine's Quill, and a professor of...
creative writing and English literature
at
Loras College in Dubuque, Iowa.
Thanks very much again.
Thank you, Nigel.